Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out today. It's great to see everybody here. It's such a wonderful day. My name is George Reary, in case I haven't had the opportunity to meet you yet. And I'm going to keep my comments very brief. I only want to mention two things. One is that you may have picked up a call for proposal for the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning Conference to be held here next fall. Please considering submitting a proposal and being part of that conference. And if you've had any questions or concerns about that, feel free to contact me directly. And that's about it, really. That's what I had to say. And I'm going to turn this over to Brad Wheeler, who's going to introduce our guest. And Brad is the Vice President of Information Technology here at IU. Thank you. Thank you, Brad.
It's a pleasure to see such a large gathering today, and particularly so many graduate students and teaching assistants here for this event as well. By introduction, John Seeley Brown is the third nationally recognized scholar to visit our campus this academic year as part of IU Bloomington's Scholarship of Teaching and Learning initiative. In doing so, he's joining with us and many here who are engaged in a very productive and ongoing dialogue about evidence-based conversations concerning the practice of good teaching and how such practices can result in a deep and meaningful learning experience for all students attending Indiana University. Over the past 10 years, such scholarly conversations have become an integral part of the SOTL community. When I had a little bit more time as a professor, instead of running around to meetings incessantly as I do now, I was happy to be involved in some of the SOTL activities and know the value of a community like this that can help create evidence and research-based practices about improving education. It's also worth mentioning that this particular event is somewhat unique in terms of a SOTL activity and a presentation on this campus. It's because it's bringing a noteworthy scholar to Indiana as a collaborative effort between Indiana University, Bloomington University Information Technology Services, and the Indianapolis and South Bend campuses. So John will be doing partial tour of all Indiana University very, very rapidly today and tomorrow. And in that regard, I'd like to give my personal thanks to Professor Sonia Stevens, our new Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education. We're working very effectively with her office on things like the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning and the role of information technology as it may affect the campus. So I'm sure many of you already know of John Seeley Brown. To introduce him as Dr. Brown is to miss Doctor 4 times, given he does have a doctorate from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, one of our close cousins, and 4 honorary degrees. John is often out there. I run into him from time to time at various conversations. We were most recently together at a conference called the Open Forum, which was examining trends in open scholarly publishing, open educational resources such as textbooks, open source software, and where are these trends regarding open going in a macro sense of how they affect the very core missions of research and education at Indiana University. I think John needs no further introduction other than to say JSB is here.
Thank you, of course. It's so strange for us not to be on stage together, but we do it sequentially. Now, the best way to do a talk is to start with questions, but I've been told that's not allowed. I have to say something first. Although we had 2 great sessions already today just with questions. I don't want to give you anything like a formal talk. I want to kind of flash by a set of images. These are evocative images, hopefully that they will evoke thoughts in our own mind. Some of these images will resonate with some of you, some will fall flat, but the hope is that at least something here triggers some new thought in each person. So with that, let me get going on the general topic of learning in the networked digital age. I think it's fair to say that we actually have a unique challenge. That unique challenge is, how do we prepare students for a constantly changing world? There's no longer a question of just being kind of punctuated evolution, where there's a big change and things will stabilize out. We have some fairly interesting arguments to say, no, change is here constantly. It ain't going to change for probably the next 50 to 80 years. I won't argue why that's the case, but that's our current best guess. What does this mean? I think what it means is we have to rethink an awful lot. We got to rethink, what do we need to learn? After all, most of what we learn, not all, but most of what we learn is going to be kind of relatively outmoded 5 or 10 years from now. So what should we be learning? How should we be learning? In fact, how do we learn? And how must learning itself become a lifelong habit? So part of the question is, how do we set the stage here to create a new culture of learning amongst all our students as they leave here? And I think the catch is, if you want to really think about this today, we got to think about how to look at this kind of new culture of learning in terms of leveraging, I'm going to call it the net generation. The net generation and how they think, learn, work, socialize. And how might, in fact, social media become a very major ally in this push toward rethinking a new culture of learning? But let me flash back a few hundred years and say, let's take a classical view of learning, not one that I think anybody in this room particularly holds, but you might call it the Cartesian view of learning, where we think of knowledge as a substance, and what we do as teachers is basically pour knowledge into a kid's head. And pedagogy might be considered kind of a way to get an optimal impedance match between what we pour and what the receptor actually is. So we think about pedagogy as at least knowledge transfer, and we tend to test that way. And in fact, you might think that this notion of learning and teaching actually will end in change being resisted. Because once you've had all this stuff poured into your head and you build up these stocks and these assets, and you spent years and years and years building these stocks and assets, well, you probably are not particularly open to saying, now I got to have more stuff poured into my head after 5 years from now. Let's go back to school yet again. This is not a winning conversation to have with almost anybody. Likewise, it's not a winning conversation to think that we are all skilled in building these beautiful silos, cultivated rows of knowledge, which almost never kind of cross-fertilize with each other. And as those of you that have known me for some time, I like to think about replacing the Cartesian I think, therefore I am, with this very simple notion, although it has profound long-term ramifications, the social view of learning. That is to say, we participate, therefore we are. We come into being through participation. Now again, I don't want to bore you with all kinds of psychoanalytic mumbo-jumbo about object relation theory, but this actually has a very deep root in terms of how do we come into being, and I think it has some very simple roots in terms of the fact that today it's not too hard to imagine how we do come into being by participation with others. And I want to stress that our understandings tend to be socially constructed. That is not to claim that knowledge is socially constructed. This is not a postmodern claim, ... But we are saying that basically our understandings usually turn out to be socially constructed, usually in conversations and so on. And in fact, if you look at this, you might think that learning is much more kind of chaotic, and we kind of learn in and through our interactions with each other and with the world itself. This is not surprising. After all, a wonderful study was done at Harvard some time ago, commissioned by the president, to ask, what is the single best predictor of being successful at Harvard, after having gotten in, that is? The answer is very simple. It turns out your ability to form or join study groups, beginning and end of story. If you know how to join a study group, you will succeed. If study groups don't exist, if you know how to form a study group, you would doubly succeed. The ability to create, join, lead study groups is incredibly important. And of course, in a study group, guess what? You are basically socially constructing your understanding from each other, working with each other, and so on and so forth. In fact, it's no surprise, a lot of TAs in here right now there's no better way to learn something than to have to teach something. And in a study group, you're both a learner and a teacher in a peer-based type of learning situation. And you learn an awful lot about how to connect, to read, to communicate with each other this way. So I think it's kind of obvious, but it tends to be overlooked. And in fact, in some schools, and I won't take you through some horror stories that Sasha and I both know about, and I think you know about as well, from Toronto, where basically sometimes this is called cheating. Nevertheless, this does turn out to be the world's most effective way to go. And in fact, a very interesting recent article in Science by Eric Musser was actually getting at a very interesting point, because he actually teaches huge lectures in electricity and magnetism at Harvard. And he has been developing a clicker method. You all know what clickers are. You throw up questions, and students now click, and this is a brilliant breakthrough in interaction. Well, first of all, it's not, but it can be if used right. And he made the most interesting observation when he talks to faculty members at Harvard, is this is not about the technology. If you try to become sage on the stage with a clicker, you are sage on the stage. Without clicker, doesn't matter. But if you actually start thinking about how do you evolve your teaching practices, and I'm going to come back to this in a big way in a moment, then the game starts to change. A very simple example, nicely said in Science a few months ago, saying this is not a question of technology. This is a question of how does technology enable you to engage in new teaching practices. And the game that all of us in this room knows, it's the creation of new practices that we have to think about. And curiously, and thank God for some of us, these notions of study groups, and we've actually done some very interesting example studies of this, work in the virtual world as well as in the physical world. That is to say that students all the time are going back to their dorms and IMing each other and so on and so forth. In fact, I gave a talk in Chicago on digital learning, and this mother walks up to me and says, "John, I got this terrible, terrible, terrible problem." I said, "What's happening?" She said, "My daughter, 14 years old." I said, "Yes." "All she wants to do is study." I said, "What?" "You're the first person that's approached me that as a problem." She said, no, you don't understand. What she's doing, she goes to her room and she can't wait to get on IM, and she does all her homework on IM. And I first said the obvious question, why do you think she's doing homework? But we got beyond that quickly, and it turned out she was. And in fact, doing work together, even virtually, is a lot of fun. In fact, there's several of us in this room that know that the fundamental mantra in hardcore video gaming in the world of Warcraft and things like that is the mantra, if I ain't learning, it ain't fun. If you're not learning, it ain't fun. End of story in World of Warcraft. That's a long story there, but that's the end of the story. But the sense of a lot of fun comes up in doing problems together, discussing things together. In fact, think about it. We all know when we came home from college at, sophomores and being introduced to our first course in philosophy, our ability to sit around the kitchen table with our buddies and talk about things was a wonderful experience. Well, this now is what's going on all the time. But let's consider this idea more generally. And we actually got into a beginning discussion. I think a very interesting example of an ideal type of learning environment is actually the atelier method of teaching architecture. Now, I'm going to talk about this in architecture qua architecture, but then I want us to think about how we might generalize this idea. Let's consider what happens in architecture as an architectural student, an architectural studio in a university. Well, first of all, guess what? By the way, this is also true in professional studios as well. All work in progress is always rendered in public. So you're always aware of the person next to you, how that person is thinking, struggling, trying, screwing up, swearing, all this kind of stuff. But you are kind of a co-peripheral participant of what this person is doing. And why is that important? It's important because studios are very costly to run. If you are a master in teaching a studio course, you can't afford very much time kind of critiquing students. But look what happens. One of the things that happens is you come in and the master critiques this student about this particular project, but all the other students hear the critique. What's interesting is that basically these students also participated in the thinking, problem-solving processes that this student went through. So basically, it's a very rich social context. This kind of comment that the master makes to this one student is well situated in terms of how all the other students kind of understand the thinking that went into this. So bang, you right away got a beautiful amplification. I learned from listening. But furthermore, if you now move on, it turns out that by watching, often the architecture studios have one common problem. I get to watch how other people go about attacking this problem, my peers. And so I start to kind of realize that there are multiple ways to look at this problem, and I begin to understand right off the bat how I'm learning how this other person is approaching this problem. So right away, you get kind of the beauty of recognizing that there are often very valid, multiple ways to approach a problem. For a rapidly changing world, you can't imagine something better than that. But on top of that, what you're really learning here is you're learning how to enculturate into a practice. This is not just learning knowledge. These studio courses are always coupled with kind of more standard courses, but you're actually starting to become a legitimate peripheral participant in the design processes, and you're appropriating, a practice, blah, blah, blah. We can come back to this, but the real question is, does this generalize? Because very few in this room, in fact, I don't think any of you, I would know you if you were, are architects. And so why am I up here talking about it? Well, let's talk about this a moment. Let's talk about the teal, technology-enabled accelerated or augmented learning environments at MIT. MIT has a wonderful course, 802, for those of you coming from the East Coast, and this course is brilliant. This course is electricity and magnetism. It's the first time you start to get field equations. The first time you're forced to move away from very simple mechanistic causal models, if you understand partial differential equations. And this course takes 800 students. And by the end of the year, they get about 600 that drop out. It is a wonderful filter. If you make it through this course, you may have a chance of becoming a physicist. Well, it sounded like a very good idea for a while, except to the people that dropped out, and to the parents, and to the administration, and they said, maybe we can do a little bit better here. And the answer was, yeah, they could. They conceived the idea, borrowed, by the way, from RPI initially, that they don't talk too much about, but they do some, and also North Carolina State, that I'll come back to, saying, let's break this whole thing into a studio. We're going to learn electricity and magnetism, which is, by the way, a tough subject to learn, and we're going to do it all in the studio format. So you tore down the rooms, built these big rooms with these tables, 9 people to a table, 13 tables to a room, and the instructor basically does maybe 15 minutes at most recitations, and then throws up problems or throws up experiments. Kids and all these tables start to work on things, swap ideas. The instructor's walking around the classroom. If an interesting issue comes up that he thinks could really be, or she thinks is really going to be interesting to the whole class, interrupt the class, explain this, ... Okay? And in fact, they prototyped this, and it was wonderful. And then they spun it out. And it was a disaster. Why, it turns out? Well, the first thing was, when they spun it out, guess what? The instructors marked on a curve. Can you imagine how interested kids are in helping each other learn maximally if that table is going to be marked on a curve? I don't know how many of you are in pre-med courses or teach pre-med courses here, but the pre-med field is so competitive that you often find students actually slipping slides, so that students actually, their peers, their other students start to mess up, so they do better. So marking on a curve was not a winning idea to suddenly transform this thing into a deeply collaborative. We'll change that. By the way, guess what? Actually, still a disaster. In fact, this disaster I'm about to talk about was the one that happened first. And they had to actually stop the course, and they decided to, once they figured out what was going on, and to build a summer program. Because what was happening is none of the professors had the slightest idea of how to become mentors in the studio-based learning. They wanted to be sages on stages, And they did not like the idea of having to reinvent teaching practices in order to really leverage this type of technological breakthrough. And so MIT had to run workshops in the summer to get professors to be able to kind of figure out how to be mentors, not sages, and try to really understand how to be mentor, orchestrator, facilitator amongst peer-based learning communities. Well, you got that, you got that. The marking of the curve was actually, as they said later, it was the second discovery after they got the first part working. This idea has actually now been scaled up. There are probably 30,000 students that have now been through this program at North Carolina State. So we now actually have some basis for some real data coming in. And the data, let me just kind of summarize it very, very cursory. This kind of peer-based, studio-based learning works amazingly well for minorities and women. And they have decimated the dropouts of those two groups from doing this. This turned out to be revolutionary in terms of its impact. I'm going to put these slides up so you can look at the data more. But this now is kind of a really major platform for rethinking education at North Carolina State. MIT is now also kind of advancing this quite a bit. And MIT, if you talk to students, you will find it's not universally liked. And I was actually sent in there by a Hewlett Foundation that paid for some other stuff on open courseware to look at what was going on. And it turns out to be a very simple reason why students don't like this. You have to go to class. And in fact, when I asked kind of what's the, why do students like open courseware so well, they said, well, this is just great. I don't have to go to class at all. And it was a very interesting set of discussions. By the way, this sounded horrible to people, and I was castigated by one of the top people at MIT for ever telling this story publicly, except, guess what was happening? They were taking open courseware, and they were building study groups themselves doing peer learning of this material. And they were doing damn well in the tests. So guess what? There are a lot of ways that learning can happen. As I also kind of indicated at the beginning in terms of this notion of learning as a practice and cultivating into a practice, if you really want to think about it, it's a very interesting, useful distinction. You can either think about it as explicit knowledge is easy to transfer, and the tacit dimension of that knowledge, which is very hard to transfer unless you share it through a community of practice or network of practice. But we may also want to step back and think there's a huge distinction between learning about something and learning to be. And what we're really doing with our graduate students at a minimum is getting them to learn to be. Learn to be. In fact, learning to be, if you wish, is in fact the issue of how do you enculturate into a practice. It's a way of seeing. It's being able to engage in productive inquiry. It's a way of knowing and seeing, by the way. Sensing what constitutes an interesting problem and what constitutes an elegant solution. Some of you know my training is in mathematics and physics. I was stunned, first of all, to find out what is an elegant solution to a problem to a physicist the mathematician throws up at. The aesthetics between these two fields are completely different. I got driven to this point because I was trained originally in graduate school as a mathematician. And I realized it was not until the second year of graduate school. I was studying measure theory with Paul Helmos, brilliant analyst, if some of you may know. And the first time ever, in my presence, in front of a class, he got honestly stuck in a problem. And he turned around without batting an eyelash and said, I'll figure this out. And went through doing this problem. And I said to myself, by God, I had never, ever seen the practice of a research mathematician. I see the product of a research mathematician all the time in terms of the elegant papers that 5 of us read. But I never see the messiness, the intuitiveness, the way that you actually play with the problem. I'm going to come back to play in a moment with this problem. It was my first exposure to the practice of being a research mathematician. And I'd been through 4 years at Brown University, 2 years at the University of Michigan, as a graduate student, and it was my first exposure to the practice of being a scholar in that community. So one of the questions that I'm going to throw out here, and I'm going to say that a lot of ways we can now do this, is might it be possible, instead of kind of doing it the way of always starting with knowing about something for 4 years, or 6 years, or even 2 years, and then learning about the practice? I mean, that's what a PhD is about. I mean, you actually go do an apprenticeship to pick up the practice. Might we be able to actually invert this entire thing and say, how could I start about learning to be, start doing something, and then when I get stuck, then I want to learn about. And then I take what I've just learned and I kind of continue on, and then when I get stuck again, I go learn more. And so maybe there's a kind of a way to kind of look at a virtuous spiral or circle between learning to be and learning about, learning to be, learning about, and so on and so forth. This is not big theory, but this is something that I'm going to claim in the digital age we can do with ease. But I'm going to come back to that. Let me just go through a couple of examples of learning to be. I'm very interested in how to make things cost effective. So I was really struck in computer science the fact that we now know how to train maybe 1 million students in the practices of computer science. Not the theory, but the practice of computer science. And it's called open source programming. And what we have is we actually have a kind of distributed cognitive apprenticeship program going on. So basically, you talk about enculturating into a practice. If you want to join Apache, no, if you want to join Linux community, you have to be able to start in the periphery, learn how to gradually move from the periphery to the center by picking up more and more of the practices. You got to learn what those practices are in terms of that particular community, because Linux operates different than Apache, that operates differently than JBoss, and so on and so forth. So you actually are kind of apprenticing to the sensibilities, the aesthetics of a particular community. It's very interesting. You know, when I learned computer science, man, I tell you, we would take these big problems, and we would code them up, and the macho experience we had is, could I build some piece of code that would kind of run, but it was so mysterious that nobody could figure it out. I was trained to be opaque. And I was a hero by being able to create opaque code that no one could figure out. If I did this in open source community, I would be dead meat on the street. Because in the open source community, you learn to write code for other people to read, to learn from, and guess what? Improve. So it's a very interesting learning cycle kind of built into this. And that's why it's a very interesting form of distributed, virtual, mostly cognitive apprenticeship. But let me switch out of the sciences. Let me switch to the humanities. Decameron Webb. Decameron, famous novel, Italian literature, Florence, Black Plague, studied by everybody in Italian literature, that is. Guess what? Question was asked, maybe we could bring all the scholars in the world together on a website to have them pool all their knowledge and all their writings in short commentaries and create kind of a new common ground for this worldwide community to evolve. And Professor Riva at Brown University pioneered this idea. And it turned out to be very interesting because this platform, this open source, scholarly open platform, if you wish, turned out to be, in fact, a wonderful chance for students to now to apprenticeship in and to begin to look at the kinds of commentary that were being made between the scholars. And so for the very first time, they were getting a view of a certain kind of peer review. Now, as you know, most of us in graduate school don't get access to the thinking that goes on in peer review, because peer review is a closed process, although that's slowly being experimented with and how to open it up. On this site, you got to be a part of that process. You could see this process. And in fact, you could even add a small, write your own small piece and get these world scholars to critique you and so on and so forth. So it was a new kind of portal that was a kind of opening up of the practices of a certain kind of Italian scholarship. A new form of distributed kind of apprenticeship was happening here. By the way, it completely also changed scholarship in this field, but we can talk about that later if you want. Let's look at another example. I started out saying, the world is rapidly changing, and as you know, the world rapidly changing means that, of course, Britannica is always out of date, so therefore, what do? We go to Wikipedia. Wikipedia always is on top of everything. They are an edge document, if you wish, or edge book. And of course, you all know that you wouldn't trust Wikipedia because it's just there. Amateurs are adding to it all the time. As you also know, Nature did a famous study to look at the accuracy of Britannica versus Wikipedia. They came out saying both were equivalent, more or less. And let me just say, I wouldn't believe that study at all. I carry Britannica on this machine, and I carry Wikipedia on this machine. But what hit me is that, in fact, by asking that question, it showed how an old mode of scholarship was brain dead in terms of understanding a whole new issue. They didn't ask, are there fundamentally new practices for the reading of Wikipedia? If you try to read Wikipedia like you read Britannica, you're dead in the water. What do you do when you actually read Wikipedia? Well, the first thing you do is you open the edit page. You look at the history page. You see what are the changes. And what do you find out when you start reading the history and the edits? You find out what piece of knowledge, part of that knowledge, is still being contested. So all of a sudden, just like in the Cameron Web, you're finding out the contested part versus the non-contested part. You're seeing into the back room of Britannica that none of us are ever allowed to peer into. And so again, we're getting exposure into scholarship in the making if in fact you develop the right types of reading practices. If you don't understand how to fold back and look at what's being argued, then you can be seriously misled by reading Wikipedia. But if you understand these new reading practices, getting back to the fact that every new technology has to always be accompanied by new practices if it really is an interesting innovation, we got to think about those things. It was so curious to me that Nature didn't understand that fundamental fact. I'm sure they do now, but I think it was just kind of an interesting issue. But how do you read? What are the new reading practices? And it feels like I'm bringing coals to Newcastle here, but I don't know how many of you realize on this campus next week, or this week, December 7th, whatever you are now, there is a kind of digital literacy contest that actually poses problems for students from this campus. This is a host, Brown University, Northwestern, a couple other places, who are all participating in this contest to see who can most effectively use the internet as a resource to figure out what to believe in and what isn't. Where is the authority in the internet to kind of get an authoritative answer to a problem? Instead of necessarily teaching it, these contests become very interesting things. And I'm very glad to see that, here IU is actually started this whole process last year, and it now has become kind of the national host for this operation. It ties directly into the reading practices of something as simple as Wikipedia. You have to understand there are new practices. Anyway, let's move on. So what kind of learning is in tune with the kids today? Let me just say very simply, this is easy. You got to realize that the NetGen today and life in the digital age, networked age, is really a culture of participation. Henry Jenkins has even written an entire book on this, and actually did a very good job of saying that don't think about the digital gap, think about the participation gap, which is a very deep topic. But said very simply, in this culture of participation, think about how do you build things, how do you tinker with things? I'm going to come back to tinkering. How do you remix things? How do you share things? And in fact, as you know, there's a very tight loop today between production, consumption, production, and so on and so forth. And you might laugh at things like blogs, but blogs to be useful actually start a conversation that other people link to, comment on, track back to, and so on. But the curious thing to me, if you actually engage in these communities, as you have a famous scholar here that studies this, Sir Ted, et cetera, is that meaning gets created for these kids by thinking about what I produce that other people build on and share. And so right away, the sense of social capital, reputational capital, intellectual capital, and this is basically the essence of your stuff, has a lot to do with kind of like this sense of what can I do, even a simple remix that adds, put it back in, somebody picks up my remix, adds to it and so on. I start to have a sense of my identity being constructed, because what is education but constructing identity? Constructing identity through the sense of creation and sharing, creation and sharing, creation and sharing. So there's something kind of very interesting going on in this loop when you think about it in terms of how does meaning get created and how does identity come into being. Colleague of many of us in this room, David Wiley, actually discovered this in terms of getting his students to write blogs on stuff. And the first time that the students kind of realized that the world was reading their blogs and commenting on it, all of a sudden, writing changed. Writing inside the campus usually means I write for my professor. That's kind of boring. And I know how to play that game. By the way, that's even true in mathematics. I know how to kind of fake proofs, according to the professor. And so you're kind of writing for an audience of one. But once you engage in this other world of blogging, when you have other students kind of building on what you do, you know your peer community knows the games you're playing. And some very interesting, again, virtuous circles start to develop. And it was just kind of dramatic for him, kind of once these blogs broke out of the classroom and into the nation, how writing completely transformed itself. And you know, this is kind of old. I mean, it's a year-old story, but I mean, I think we all kind of understand this. And I just do want to put kind of one last twist on this topic in terms of this whole notion of you know, remixing and mashups. And some of you, if I had more time, I'd show you some wonderful mashups. But the interesting thing to me is if you do a remix of a film, a music, or let me say a film for the moment, or what you're really doing is engaging in a highly imaginative, you often are engaging in a highly imaginative reading of what is going on, where you're often reading the backstage as much as the forestage. In fact, in the anime world, amateur anime world, most of the remixes coming out of the amateur anime world are actually fantasizing, imagining the backstory that led to the front story. Well, you think about it. If I am thinking about the backstory that led to the front story, to the front stage story, that is not bad for close reading. We can't get our students to close read very easily. Get them to remix. You might be surprised what starts to happen. Okay, so how do we think about the fact that the provost is not here, but we're always being asked to do more with less? Are there some win-win scenarios? I want to start with a very simple observation. This has been more or less well documented, and that is the long tail actually applies to the university campus. And that is to say that basically 80% of the revenue comes from about 20% of the courses. These are the mass courses that you take first, and you flow down to the much more specialized courses. So 80% of the revenue comes from here. And there would be a slide eventually that also says that 80% of the cost comes from here. So let us ask, let's look at this part first, because this part might be treated completely different than this part. So this part you've got to ask, are there certain ways that one might be able to absolutely streamline this? And the answer turns out to be yes, going back to OpenCourseWare, one form or another. I want to show you a very interesting example. This is Walter Lewin, not a bad physicist. I forget when he got his Nobel Prize. But he's a guy that loves to teach. And this is his whole video. All his courses have been videoed, and they've been put up. And when I went back to check this, basically his course was number 4 on iTunes video. Now let me make this clear. It was number 4, not on iTunes University, but this is number 4 on all videos on iTunes. Something that's very interesting when the iTunes community finds a Nobel Prize physicist talking about some of the underlying fundamental constructs of physics so fascinating that they prefer watching that to, I can't even remember TV. I don't remember TV, but some popular TV. I had a famous one in mind, but I forgot it. Anyway, so, and as you may know, that Yale has kind of picked this up, and several other campuses have picked it up, and they have purposely selected a number of their most skilled lecturers that have taken very, very popular courses and now put them up on iTunes, iTunes U, for students to watch. Now, what does this mean? Will it mean, I mean, if I had to be called in to teach a course in electricity magnetism, or this is mechanics, I'll tell you, I wouldn't want to compete with Walter. I mean, not only is he charismatic, but he gets across the conceptual underpinnings, kind of like Richard Feynman, but slightly more understandable. This guy's fantastic. Now you can begin to say, well, maybe we should actually think about these design studios where maybe we actually run this video for a few minutes and then break out into discussion groups and have discussion groups and have the teacher in there actually kind of going around table to table to answering questions, blah, blah, blah. You can think of all kinds of ways to use this as resource material augmented by other things that you may want to do. But let's move on, because most of us spend our lives in the thin part of the long tail. Those are our research seminars that 5 students show up for, and we get paid a lot for. But this is where most of the money goes. So it is an interesting question. Might there be fundamentally new ways to more cost-effectively, play this game, which make everything kind of better and honor the intuitions that we have and what do we love most? By the way, the Decameron web that I already went through was an example of this. This is used on many, many campuses around the world. All the professors participate in creating new material to this thing, and it's kind of a very interesting edge seminar to think about. Some of you know that I do a lot of work initially in MEMS and now in nanotechnology. It's very interesting that NSF has built, well, they didn't build it, something called the Nano Hub. About I'm showing my age, 82, maybe a couple years earlier, there was something called MOSIS created, M-O-S-I-S. MOSIS is a very interesting issue. It also was something very much like the Nano Hub. We had a problem in the United States. We just invented very large-scale integration. We were turning out tens of thousands of students. Not a one knew how to design VLSI. The question is, could we jumpstart the United States as a competitive force to, in about 5 years, bootstrap our way up this curve to create a set of graduate students that could become master VLSI designers? The answer turned out to be yes. 2 tricks. One was to figure out a very simple way to figure out what the design rules of this new technology were by making small compromises in the way you build this thing. Lynn Conway, by the way, at Michigan, and Carver Mead, a genius from Caltech, kind of figured out those design rules, and then we at Park, and then moved over to ISI, built a hub. And we actually said students around the world, around the United States, could actually design chips, and we would package their chips, their designs, on many projects to a chip, many chips to a wafer, and we could slash the cost of being able to do this. And within 3 years, we had probably 5,000 students in the United States being pretty good VLSI designers, and the rest has been history. The question is, could we replicate the same thing in the nano world and in the MEMS world? There turn out to be reasons MEMS is very hard to do, nano may be easier, but here's another hub that's coming up. And here is a major resource for schools of engineering to be able to use collectively to be able to bootstrap this. And you can see being able to build all kinds of interesting seminars that have to do with putting experiments, having projects that you go to this hub to actually be able to do. So what I really want to say is that we might want to think about this in terms of how do we leverage basically each of these segments, the fat part of the tail and the long part of the tail, differently. And then how do we actually think about how might we look at to accelerate kind of a spiral that develops around. So if you're thinking about learning to be versus learning about, you might start down here and move up. Down here you find passion-based niche communities forming all the time. They kind of, when they get stuck, go up here and so on. I'm going to argue that once we get out of school, we're going to engage in this spiral. In fact, the reason that Hewlett asked me to come in to evaluate OpenCourseWare was because I personally use OpenCourseWare to constantly refresh my knowledge. So I get stuck on things, and then I go to OpenCourseWare to find out stuff, and then come back and try to use it. So there's kind of a spiral developing this way. There's also a spiral that can develop the other way. So think about these spirals and think about how some of our learning tools might actually differ depending where I am on this curve. So let me kind of try to look at the big picture here. One is we're moving toward what you might call a blended epistemology. We're moving now beyond the simple homo sapien notion, which underlies much of the reason why universities first existed. That is, man as knower. And now beginning to find interesting blends between man as knower and man as doer, homo faber and homo sapien. So a blend is starting to happen. And by the way, that blend is very consistent with another blend that's happening that may actually have to do with how do you start thinking more about leveraging peer-based learning? How do you move from just sage on the stage to various types of using social networking to drive peer-based learning? Blah, blah. Those stories are pretty obvious by now. Let me suggest there's something else on the horizon. And there's several people on this campus that are already thinking about this stuff. We picked up some of these ideas. This stuff I'm doing with Doug. That is, now let's look at, we talked about homo sapiens. We talked about homo faber. What about homo ludens? What about the notion of playing? How does knowing, making, and playing start to come together? Well, I don't want to take you through 100 years of history about where culture and playing may actually be thought about, but I want to dwell a little bit more on what homo ludens means, because it is a highly textured concept of play. Now think about it a moment. One notion of play is the freedom to fail, 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 fail again. Think about it in World of Warcraft. Think about it in terms of, I keep being told that kids today can't focus. Well, for weird reasons, I study two classes of kids. One are the kids that surf the 50 giant waves off of Hawaii, and another are extreme skateboarders. I can't tell you. Those guys are willing to fail, 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 and in a big surf, sometimes that can mean almost death. Doesn't matter. They keep trying and trying and trying and trying. They find that fun. That is play to them, perfecting to the extreme a high Q skill. Another notion of play is to play along. What is improvisation? But to play along. Another play is those of us that are mechanics, learning, when you even assemble a rector set, a mechanical set, what do you learn? You learn to keep not bind your variables too soon, keep nuts and bolts kind of loose so you can juggle things around at the very end. You want play in the system. Or if you want to build an airplane wing, you try to make that airplane wing too stiff, you're dead. Play in the wing is critical. But perhaps one of the kind of key things to recognize is the notion of play as epiphany. That is the sense of suddenly this riddle comes together. It does not come together through cognitive thinking. It comes together by letting your mind be free and play with it in ways that we don't even understand what is going on. I think that sense of play is going to turn out to be so critical for solving so many of the problems we're facing today. And we have to be able to, I think, combine kind of this notion of homo sapiens, homo faber, and homo ludens. So in fact, I want to talk about the network of affordances that might actually enable these kind of three types of epistemologies to be blended together. and sitting in this room, I'm not going to talk to you two guys sitting here about the world of Warcraft, but any of us here can talk forever on what's going on in that in terms of how these network affordances bring all three of these things together. Think about what's really happening with kind of things like YouTube, Wikipedia, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of stuff going on that sets the stage in terms of incredible resources that we can use here. But what I want to really say is perhaps the critical notion is tinkering. What is the role of tinkering? Tinkering in play, tinkering in making, and tinkering in knowing. In fact, you know, when I suddenly realized what being a research mathematician really meant, it really is knowing how to tinker with something, albeit totally abstract, until I kind of get the feeling for what's at play in the system. That is what research mathematics, by the way, is about. I wish they had told me that when I was 12 years old. But the catch is this sense of tinkering and this disposition for being willing to tinker may actually be the very essence where it provides the foundations for kind of mastering a world in constant flux. If the world was stable, stick with Homo sapien. If the world is in flux, guess what? We better think differently, and it may be bringing all three of these things together. I won't bore you more with what tinkering was really about. I do want to end a simple observation that we like to think that the purpose of a campus is what goes on in the classroom. I mean, obviously in the research labs too. But I want to argue that as much, if not more, learning happens outside of the classroom as inside. In fact, as I walk out of a great lecture, it's the conversations I have with the kid next to me walking out of that hall that I start to internalize as a conversation what this actually does mean. And so let me suggest that these ideas about how to move from kind of the hard core to the edge, to bring the edge and the core in kind of a generative dance together, I found a very interesting chart. I talked about the different roles, the primary roles of professor, learning activities, institutional arrangements, student behaviors, so on and so forth. I won't take you through this. I'd rather get the discussion going. And this, you know, as I said, I'll leave you these slides behind, except to comment one thing. This is pretty damn advanced thinking when you get a chance to read it carefully. You know where we found this? South Africa. 2 years ago. This is the kind of thinking going on in South Africa today. I mean, 2 years ago. With that, thank you. So we can have questions if you want. Yeah.
Title is Learning in the Digital Age. I want to twist that a little bit and ask you a question about teaching in the digital age. It's specifically teaching the students to have the skills, the technical skills, to push that digital age forward.
So the question is, how do we cope with?
Well, so in the broadest sense, what you've talked about is using these technologies and the new learning styles to enable traditional subject matter being taught. But there's also, I work in the technology field, teaching the actual skills of building these technologies and thinking how to use those. And so what's the role in an institution like ours in teaching the actual technical skills and thinking about how to broaden those technical skills?
Okay, but you're not talking about the technical skills of like how to build next generation computers.
Possibly, or next generation
right.
Collaborative technologies.
Okay, okay. You know, I think this won't be a popular statement, but I think the catch is it comes back to homo ludens. That's to say that if we are in fact working in a rapidly changing world, so let's take some of your computer scientists here. You know, how do you do cloud computing? How does Google actually do the magic that they actually do? Okay, to a very large extent, that's something that had to be completely reinvented. In fact, a huge amount of what we're doing today is reinventing. And that has a sense of saying we're no longer the authority. We are kind of capable of playing with this stuff. And what we might be able to do is be able to get multiple people to be able to play and try to triangulate on what we're learning from this play. And so what I find so exciting is all of a sudden, we now have a blending of research and teaching going hand in hand, because we as teachers bringing students in can actually engage the students with us in struggling. And so kind of what happened with me and Paul Helmos should be happening first year, not sixth year. But it should be working on things we don't know. Now, the catch why this is so important and why Doug and I moved beyond Homo sapien, or at least the narrow meaning of Homo sapien, is that basically authorized knowledge, authority, now is up for question. Because in a rapidly changing world, and a person that, as you know, I spend half my life and make almost all my money doing innovation, to me, the biggest obstacle to innovation is wisdom. And why is that? It's because wisdom is based on authority. And guess what? Authority is based on experiences and assumptions that by and large are no longer valid. Just think in this room, almost everything we do in the social and technical sciences is based on the Gaussian distributions, normal curves. What about, in fact, normal ain't normal? What about if, in fact, everything is kind of much more close to a power law? If you have power law distributions, all you have is black swans. I'm willing to argue at some point that we don't know anything about how to reason rationally about events in power laws for deep, profound reasons. And wisdom is our biggest enemy. So we have to suddenly blow open our own thinking to begin to realize that prototypic examples are really good when you have normal distributions, but if you have power law distributions, maybe not. So let me give you a very concrete example of this abstract mumbo-jumbo. I don't know how many of you struggle with intellectual property management on this campus. And if you have technology offices to help you, every campus, I'll talk more about University of Michigan since Paul isn't here, but Paul and I, Karan, who will be here next week, week after next, started this argument some time ago. The payoff, almost no school covers the cost of technology transfer. But every school is riveted from the faculty senate to the provost to the president to the trustees on how to manage intellectual property, because there's so much money. And there's so much money because, guess what? They remember an extreme case. They remember what certain kinds of splicing did, gene splicing did at Stanford, or computer music did, or a few other things. They remember the edge cases. And you might say, come on, guys, you're not that dumb. I mean, those are edge cases. Think about the norm. Well, just to walk away with one very simple observation. There is no norm, there is no prototype, there is no typical example in a power law distribution. The human mind is so unprepared to reason about things that don't have examples, prototypic examples, family resemblances. And so that's where our wisdom comes from. That's why many of you struggle with kind of rules that are based on normal distribution here on this campus, or any campus, I don't know your campus in particular. And it's just, it's curious to me. So we need a whole set of new institutional innovations that are more equipped to think about something so fundamental as a non-Gaussian world. That doesn't mean that there aren't some Gaussian things still happening. Let me just end this little riff with one concrete example, because I love architecture. If the heights in this room are normally distributed, it is easy to build this room. If we were distributed according to a power law, you couldn't begin to even imagine how to build this room. because there'd be bunches and bunches and bunches of us that would be 1 foot tall. And then there'd be some of us that would be 1,000 feet tall. And you couldn't find a way to design a building. Beginning and end of story. That's why basically the power laws you see all the time in the virtual world more, internet storms and things like this, but they're coming into the physical world too. And it's very interesting to just kind of think of how much of our wisdom is based on certain things. But I won't go down financial crisis at the moment. Yeah.
I'll raise one point. Sometimes we tell the story, the presumption is that we have these wonderfully motivated learners that, gosh, these old sages on the stage would just teach in a different way and get out of the way and let them really collaborate and co-construct and all. But we also know the reality is, too, some of our learners, I mean, there's a distribution of them as well. Some who are highly motivated and thrive in construction, groups, etc. And some who view that as, look, I'm paying you to teach me. Why aren't you teaching me? I didn't want to learn from Susie or Bob or somebody, you know, what do they know? I'm paying you. And still, our students, even at this age, are still sometimes very much stuck in that mentality themselves. Do you have any thoughts about how instructors who want to teach more in this approach can break through some of that cultural challenge itself?
Well, first of all, students are paying you a fortune not to be taught to, but to get a certificate that has economic value afterwards. Let's be clear about that. But I think, you know, it's very interesting. The kids that we find are most turned on in terms of other style of learning are kids that come from the margin, not the elite class. Because the elite class have come through helicopter parenting, and they have been managed since they were 7 years old to create a portfolio so they can get into their school of choice. And when they don't get into their school of choice, then they go someplace else. But, you know, and this whole sense of this incredibly managed learning. It's just very hard to see somebody who's been through this managed process then be given the freedom to say, well, no, why don't you think about learning as being fun, okay? And it's so curious, and you know, Mimi Ito has just finished with a bunch of colleagues some amazing studies about kind of what's happening in the social life of kids, about how they hang out and what the hanging out is all about, and so on and so forth. And lo and behold, that's why I actually started studying kids that do skateboarding and surfing. They're on the margin. These kids have unbelievable passion. And I gave kind of a talk like this with, at Berkeley, which is, you know, pretty damn open school. And my colleague, my co-author of Social Life and Information, came up to me afterwards. He says, John, he said, I don't know what campus you've been to, but any Berkeley, I can't get my students to do anything of interest. He said, you know, there's a real problem. And in fact, Berkeley being a highly elite school, is a worse problem than schools that aren't super elite. Because kids, you know, that are not going to the super elite schools actually tend to have a little bit more flexibility on the margin, so to speak. So, you know, I think about actually, I've actually semi-seriously proposed this. You know, we ought to take kids the first 6 months on campus and tell them to go spend 6 months in a developing country. And just learn to survive as a small group of kids. Do something in a developing country, a serious developing country. I don't mean, you know, south of right. I was going to say some part of the U.S., but I mean, you know, because once you get out of your current frame, you got to deframe it, and that's very hard because you know you don't have the freedom to do serious reframing right away. Now, you know, in terms of the you know, a liberal education, you know, why do you actually find teaching philosophy so useful? I mean, philosophy, I mean, there's almost no course more disturbing to a freshman or a sophomore if taught well is a course in philosophy, because that shakes them up. And once they get shaken up and realizing their beliefs don't have much solid basing to them, then they may be open more. So I think a combination of a liberal education and sending kids into the third world. For short periods of time, you would find completely different student body. And the irony is, take the first year tuition, send them off, pay their costs to do this. It would be the best use of the money. So that's yeah.
So continuing in how you're talking about beliefs and how students need to change their perceptions, one of the things that we commonly run across is, in terms of technology integration, working with K-12 schools, is teacher beliefs and how teachers really haven't changed into this new notion. So in teacher education programs, we may give them this very rich constructivist type of feeling where it's technology integration and all these innovative tools and innovative practices, but we don't necessarily see that implemented in the classroom. Do you have any thoughts about why that may be taking place, or what can we do in order to maybe jar our teacher beliefs in a similar type of capacity?
Two brief kinds of comments. One, you can tell, in some sense, I'm a reborn Dewey. And the curious thing to me is, I think Dewey came along 80 years too soon, because all the ideas of Dewey can now play out in today's digital world because of an infinite set of assets that are just lying around the internet. Tools, communities to join, virtual communities to join, physical communities to join, so on and so forth. So you actually have the sense of creating authentic learning contexts that had to be conned up, created kind of artificially in the school setup. And so, I wish we'd just bring him back, and we can. Now the catch is, and we do have a problem of departments of education because, understandably or whatever, they're very slow to pick up these ideas. But the real problem, of course, is once you get out in the real world, teachers have no time to do anything, and we just don't provide the freedom. Now, we're at as you probably know, at an amazing turning point. Arnie Duncan, the department Secretary of Education, has just been given $100 billion to reinvent some of these things. And very interestingly, he understands half that money should go to reinventing schools. The other half should be saying, what about learning outside of the schools? And how do we actually say not all learning has to happen in the schools, and in fact, maybe we should take the school building and after 3 o'clock in the afternoon transform it into something else. So there's a lot of new ideas that are beginning to be kind of talked about. As I mentioned, I do a lot of work in Singapore. Singapore, as I said this morning, woke up a few years ago and they kind of recognized that they had the best 20th century education in the world. Their TIM scores are unbelievable, the best in the world, so on and so forth. And they suddenly realized it didn't matter. Those skills have almost nothing to do with the 21st century. So they decided they had to reinvent completely their education system from K up through school, through college. The interesting thing about them is they said, John, we're going to take at least 16 years to do it. This is not something you do overnight. This is slow, it is progressive. We're heading all year, all levels simultaneously, doing small. Here again is a beautiful ecology of experiments being run in all kinds of different schools inside Singapore at different levels. Blasphemy has now happened. You can actually get into the university without going through A-level exams. Believe me, that's almost caused a revolution, albeit only 15% of the students can, but nevertheless, as a start. But what's so interesting to me is, what the mantra now is in Singapore? Teach less, learn more. And it's very interesting. They have one strategic direction. Teach less, learn more. And everything starting at kindergarten in these schools that are following this, the first wave, are all being done collaboratively. All based on productive inquiry. And if you know about productive inquiry, you ain't going to cover anywhere near as much material. And so the real catch is, what happens. And let me just kind of end with one surprising story, and this data is now out. A lot of people are against kind of productive inquiry or experimental learning because kids learn wrong things. And in a Confucius society, learning wrong things is really wrong. We're used to it. So they wanted to be able to prove that this kind of productive inquiry actually was good. And so they did some beautiful controlled experiments. Actually did some of these things first in India. No comment about where Singapore runs its experiments, but to look at this issue. And lo and behold, at the end of the year, they did the testing. The results came in. And guess what the results were? There was no difference between the kids that had been taught and the kids that had kind of figured everything out on their own. Okay? But thank God they had one other idea. Let's test them a year later. They tested them a year later, and the kids that had been taught about down here, and the kids that had done the productive inquiry were up here. This was no longer a question of minor statistical significance. This was an overwhelming result. Almost nothing had been retained a year later. Everything had basically been retained, this form. And that data is less than, I think, about probably 3 months old. And it's, it's the beginning to say, we may want to think about how we do testing different. I have to get it to you. The kid who did it is a guy named Manur, M-A-N-U-R. And I think he's now on the Institute for NIE in Singapore. Yeah.
Well, you raised testing. I'm curious what you think about the push to the so-called testing and standardizing 21st century skills like Microsoft. Cisco and Intel have a huge consortium now that's going to standardize and test sort of new skills. And I don't know what your opinion is of that.
Microsoft and I agree to disagree on almost everything. Although I am using a Microsoft machine, as you noticed. This is a very complicated and emotional topic. And there's a lot of talk about 21st century skills. And the trouble is, if you say here are the 21st century skills, the first reaction is we've got to teach them. And that may be fundamentally wrong. In fact, England has just decided to teach kids how to do Twitter. I said, what? You want to get the kids to come in and teach the professors how to do Twitter, maybe, but this is ridiculous. Now, there's more to that story that makes it not quite so ridiculous, but you get the spirit. I'm kind of biased too. The real catch is, and this is a big argument between me and the 21st century skills people, is you're missing the point. The real point is, what is the dispositions? If you can get somebody that has the disposition, I'm going to call it a questing disposition, a gaming disposition, you're going to get people that embrace change. And the more that they embrace change, the more they will feel completely comfortable in going up to the fat part of the tail, finding stuff, trying it out, talking to their peers about it, and so on and so on. But let's face it, well, this is less true in an academic setting, but I could say in a corporate setting, I can say in a room like this, there's virtually nothing any of us know in this room that we didn't learn from somebody else. We didn't learn it in the school. Now, in an academic setting, that's not quite so true. But the fact is the ability to learn from others and to be able to want to learn from others that really is the 21st century. And I'm going to call it the 21st century disposition. And, the economists in the room, Nobel Prizes or not, they say, well, how do you teach disposition? I say, that's the wrong question. You don't understand disposition if you ask me how to teach it. Disposition is not a skill. It is something else. And, you know, you talk to an economist about Polanyi and a few other things like this, and pretty soon, you know, you're talking to a blank wall. Actually, I got to be careful. This is being webcast. I forgot about that. Well, economists think very deeply about some things. Just not this. But the, you know, so I think, you know, if you're going into the workforce, you know, if you don't know something, you ought to be willing to pick it up. And, you know, I just can't, I mean, like, I'm at a place where they say, well, we've got to train people how to do PowerPoint slides. And I said, you know, there's something fundamentally wrong with that thought. You know, like, you know, creating an opportunity to screw around and mess around and you know, be with peers that can help you in a culture that says, yeah, I know you're not going to know something, and I'm going to help you. That's what really matters. And when you have that kind of a culture, change becomes second nature. And that's why I think that, you know, the sense of defining a 21st century skill is understandable, but probably wrong. I hold very mild opinions.
You've got a pretty tight itinerary. I believe you're going to be hitting the road pretty quick, so I think we're going to wrap it up right now. I'd like to thank you very much.
Okay.